A good evening to everyone here. I am resuming the reading of these notes that I've been making on the ethics of the real by Alenka Zupancic, and it has been a bit of a trajectory that has gotten us here. If you remember, we were trying to, in some ways, try to situate how subjection was thought of prior, or rather after Althusser's break, and I think it was basically him who popularized the term and its study within the discipline of philosophy. And we had taken up Judith Butler's text, The Psychic Life of Power. And I think I had presented a couple of videos in trying to unpack what its chapters sought to posit for the kind of struggles and incomplete subjections which any attempt to formulate a coherent and self-transparent subject almost seems to necessarily come to face with. And of course, the question of resistances. Now, I had branched, or rather, I had paused this reading of the psychic life of power to take up directly the question of what impels the subject rather than merely constitutes them in ethics of the real. And towards this endeavor, I had presented a couple of videos on the foreword and the introduction to the ethics of the real, which you can find on my channel. And what I will do today is to present my notes on the first chapter titled um, The Moral Pathology of Everyday Life. So let's get to it. The title of the chapter before our consideration is The Moral Pathology of Everyday Life, and we are introduced to the idea of pathology as that which does not belong to the order of the ethical, according to Kant, or better yet, what the order of the ethical is subtracted from. This does not mean that pathology here is in some way constructed or thought of as abnormal, a predicament or consideration, if you prefer, which Foucault, perhaps in consonance with some sections of civil society, indulges in. Rather, pathology is recognized as prosaic, everyday, and indeed inherent in the normal. Pathology, for Kant, is when we act impelled, as it were, not by the conduct of our actions themselves, but because of an incentive, something which may be produced as a result, or, better yet, a reward for our labors, as is customary in contractual relations in capitalism. The word he uses is Triebfeder, which the author also translates as drive. In less prosaic terms, there is a kind of attachment to our suffering, as it were, which is voluntarily chosen by the subject. A literary example is cited in Swan in Love from Proust's series. The hero's love for Odette causes him suffering, and this leads him to seek to relinquish this love, so that his suffering may cease. Upon more careful examination, however, he realizes that he does not want this, as his love for Odette is now a part of who he is. Instead, he only wishes for his suffering to stop. As the author puts it, his experience of the pleasure of love depends on the condition. The lesson here is worth noting. What the subject is really attached to is not this or that particular pleasure, but the frame within which pleasure or pain are commensurable to the subject. The psychoanalytic name for which is fantasy. We may now apprehend why Lacan insists on a moment of ex nihilo creation as the only opening for a true theoretical materialism. And the author also observes, similarly, that the Lacanian insistence of suicide as the only successful act. A new subject may emerge, but she would not be the same as before. In terms of a challenge to custom and doxa, a tendency which is perhaps prevalent today as well, though perhaps not in the same measure as in Kant's time, is the distinction between a higher and a lower faculty of desire. The exercise of power, for instance, was acknowledged by Kant himself as possibly pleasurable, a joy experienced in being able to perform a gymnastic skill may allow us to feel this, as may the delight of constructing a philosophical argument. These are not distinguished in psychoanalysis from sensual pleasures, desire being an emergent and unary force. It is this distinction that between lower, perhaps carnal, and higher, i.e., sublimated pleasures, that is contradicted in the formulation presented. To quote the author herself, the feelings of pleasure, by virtue of which they constitute the determining ground of the will, is always similar in character. Those of us familiar with the characterization of jouissance will recognize a certain Kantian ethical resistance against the possibility of gradualism as capable of securing a lasting change in disposition. This is to be read as his critique of the improvement, or rather his critique of improvement and reform as possible strategies in any ethical venture. In ways, the ethical engagement here may be thought of as corollary, if not structurally similar, to the moment of decision or inspiration, which the force to, where the force to make a change or seize a chance grips us. So this is how the ethical moment is framed by Kant, as opposed, or rather perhaps in critique of gradualism or reformation. Emphasis is placed by the author on how a Kantian ethics, as presented, is not an act of adherence. This is brought out in the distinction between legality, where an act is in accord with the law, and that act in which I quote, the idea of duty arising from the law is also an incentive. End of quote. The latter would be an example of morality. And this may be worth repeating. Um, the idea of duty arising from the law is also an incentive for the act to be done, and not merely for it to accord with the law. And this would be the example of morality presented. This is the sense in which the ethical proper is surplus to legality, a position which a reader of philosophy may notice is aligned with Badiou's grasp of the real as a conceptual category, initially posited by Lacan. The real is thought here is not demarcatable within the mutually exclusive alternatives of the knowable and the unknowable. The unknowable here is already known, in the sense of it being perhaps a limit or the degenerate case of the knowable. This is not the real which we are mentioning, forgetting as it does the other of a discourse. Illegality hence would still fall within the register of legality for Kant, as it sorts acts based upon their ability to either conform or not with duty. The project of an ethics of the real, as posited by the author in the title, would be that which escapes such a register. To emphasize, even were an ethical act to conform with duty, this is not what would make it ethical. Here, I would like to point perhaps a divergence in the work in question from a more Kantian position, which would posit the freedom to question, yet only beneath the observance of obedience. However, I think we have made some headway in our liberties since Kant wrote an answer to the question, what is enlightenment? And I do not think he would look unfavorably upon this updated formulation. To account for this excess in the ethical, which makes it supernumerary, as it were, that is, a site capable of introducing supernumerary claims, and as a register which is beyond, or perhaps not necessarily bound, to that of legality and its dichotomy. The author suggests that we may require recourse to the meaning given to form by Kant. Let me repeat this. To account for this excess in the ethical which makes it supernumerary, as it were, that is, a site capable of introducing supernumerary claims, and as a register which is beyond or perhaps not necessarily bound to that of legality and its dichotomy, the author suggests that we may require recourse to the meaning given to form by Kant, as how we may account for such a moment in the ethical. To be clear, the author does acknowledge the difference between her and the Kantian approach to ethics. For Kant, for an action to be ethical, it must not only conform with duty, but this conformity is to be its only driving force or motive, so to speak. This is how the Kantian emphasis on form may allow us to disclose a drive. The author puts this quite nicely. Kant's point, I repeat, is not that all traces of materiality have to be purged from the determining grounds of the moral will, but rather that the moral law has itself to become material in order for it to function as a motive force for action. End of quote. An advantage of the form of theory that we should note is the ability of this medium to explicate subjective relations to oneself, a world, and others without formulating prescriptions in any substantive sense. Indeed, in an analysis as for Kant, an understanding which grasps for content at the expense of form cannot but be pathological. Recall, however, the observation made by Lacan regarding something akin to a primordial perversion in Kant, that which would lead him to frame a deontological ethics in the first place, perhaps not unlike the extent of epistemic doubt Descartes entertains in formulating his cogito. This is an insight which the author, Alenka Zupancic, picks up on. To quote, "This is the real miracle involved in ethics. The crucial question of Kantian ethics is not how can we eliminate all the pathological elements of will so that only the pure form of duty remains, but rather how can the pure form of duty itself function as a pathological element, that is, as an element capable of assuming the role of a driving force or incentive of our actions." Let me repeat this. The crucial question of Kantian ethics is not how can we eliminate all the pathological elements of will so that only the pure form of duty remains, but rather how can the pure form of duty itself function as a pathological element, that is, as an element capable of assuming the role of a driving force or incentive of our actions. The author notices a curious paradox here, regarding the disparaging of such action, even if it were to coincide with an ethical act, merely on the basis that were the act in question itself to be a driving impetus for the subject, it would not seem to require sacrifice, suffering, or renunciation. On these grounds it may seem lacking. The question which is yet forwarded, however, is how the surplus introduced by the ethical in relation to the legal is conceptualized. The wager of the text in consideration is that this surplus can only be recognized as a form. This exploration of form, embarked upon by the author, recognizes this emergent concept, so to speak, not empty of content as much as outside content. In fact, she does state that this may be a form that provides form only to itself. In this sense, one may well recognize in such a formulation the Kierkegaardian notion of a private God, and some may want to even make the comparison of a private religion, not unlike Jews under Christian persecution. Do note that these examples of mine are substantive examples, in the sense that they refer to real predicates which may be read about or encountered in the world. In this sense, not exactly a form outside of content. And this does seem to be an important point that is made in the text. In being confronted by a surplus that serves no purpose, we may be led to say that this would represent the failure of form and not the presence of one. A pure waste is in fact the term used to describe this surplus. I think this is worth tarrying with for a moment. Were we to entertain a Badiouian subtractive ontology, for instance, which recognizes a form in that which can repurpose a formless, though essentially open void, or rather that which can produce a purpose via the form in question, functioning as such as a structure, then what may a form which resembles a pure waste be with respect to content? And here we may be forced to hypothesize a form that seeks some other content, or better yet, that may produce it. The author does carefully notice an important difference between the Kantian notion of the ethical and the Lacanian notion of desire, even if both were conceptualized to address similar problems. Kant insists that the ethical, that surplus to legality, can be recognized only as a form. Note, not in a form, but as a form, and there is no necessity for the form itself to be substantive. The phrase used to depict this is not only in accord with duty, but also only for the sake of duty. The Lacanian conception of desire, however, is as an object and not a form, and in this sense, or rather in the study of how a body, a subject, or a discourse appropriates an object, we learn something of its desire, or better yet, the inconsistency in its desire as it represents them. Yet here, too, the author notices definite similarities. What kind of similarities are we talking about here? Well, in its representation in the text, it seems to entail a sublation of a kind. If the Kantian ethical act is defined as that which is done without seeking an object, or without an object drive, to use the author's words, or object cause, to use Lacan's, there is yet the introduction of practical reason, a seeming necessity here which does, or rather is driven by an object drive, or to use the Kantian term for it, ecte triebfeder, which may be translated to real object drive. Yet there seems to be an assertion made by the author which is over and above this, that is, that the object drive of the will is defined precisely in terms of pure form in the absence of any Triebfeder. Here is where the similarity becomes apparent to us. The object petit is utilized to mark the absence of the object of desire, or rather the pure form of its apprehension. To quote the author, the void around which desire turns. A touch of excess indeed is marked by the author when she writes that even after the object of desire is attained and the subject has what she or he may want, desire continues on its own. Object petit here becomes a marker of what the subject still has not got. In this sense, we can see how the real was initially formulated by Lacan as that which resists symbolization absolutely. or to represent this from the other side, the symbolic as our only register, which can mediate between the imaginary and the real. The link between the object petit and the Kantian notion of form, in a sentence, is this: desire can be defined precisely as the pure form of demand, and perhaps more dangerously, what remains of demand when all particular objects which can satisfy it are removed. To quote Jacques Lacan himself, "That's not it" means that in the desire of every demand there is but the request for object A. End of quote. In speaking of motivations and their possible pathological dimensions, it is forthcoming of a psychoanalyst to be able to bring to our notice not so much some primordial pathology in desire, a rather cynical position with its own philosophical proponents ranging from the Buddha to Schopenhauer, but a way in which that which was experienced as pathological in desire is marked by desire. When this object is attained, lost, or is simply no longer a factor. This interpretation of the object petit a, as it were, may be in a sense akin to the Bedouin notion of fidelity to an event as what marks a subject. Indeed, periodization here, a term which some may claim is what history is about, becomes a function of the recognition by a subject of what constituted the real of their desire. Now, I would like to state peripherally that this is, or rather, this was a dense chapter in terms of the kinds of arguments that it takes up. And in seeking to present a cursory appraisal via a review, I seek to draw on what its key arguments are in terms of how it seeks to engage a problematic that it encounters. And I also try and in some ways relate it to my earlier efforts regarding the question of subjection, or how does a subject come to recognize themselves, in what terms, and how do these relate with perhaps questions such as social identities, which I suppose the question of subjection itself would deal more precisely with. Yet at some point we would have to contend with the fact that at no point can we completely think of a subject merely in terms of how its identity is recognized by an other. In that sense, the ethics of a subject is what we would have to focus on in terms of trying to locate how a subject would constitute themselves in terms of their acts. And this is where I think the Kantian moment in the study of ethics becomes, in many ways, a useful and vital breakthrough. Now, there are many things we could do from here. In fact, I had made a small note at the end of this chapter as a possible alternative, which I shall present to you. At this point in the study, I must notice a temptation in myself, given the heavy reliance and reference to Kant, to be able to share with you a little piece of his work that once really had me tied up. I may be forgetting which text. I think it is reference to the Critique of Pure Reason, though he probably makes the argument in another book that freedom presupposes morality. Now, for a long time, the continental tradition has been against metaphysics, even if there are some remarkable 20th century exceptions arising out of France. Yet I think we may still have something to learn from a philosopher who, if nothing else, is capable of bearing a certain fidelity to a subject, not merely to enshrine a past, but in daring to come to terms with what made any possible narrative of that subject possible in the first place. Also, I think it would be instructive to any curious amateur philosopher to be able to sample some of Kant's prose, an argument which is rather singular in its precision and rigor. This may be a project which is shelved, however, for I do think we should persist with our study of Alenka Zupancic's text presently. And this is what I did come to as a conclusion and what I would return to in the next video with the chapter 2 as the focus, which is titled The Subject of Freedom. So you have that to look forward to. Again, I would emphasize that you read the text itself from my blog, which I will leave a link to in the description to this video. As usual, I invite and in fact beseech you to provide some criticism regarding how you would perhaps like some of these videos to go in terms of where they seek to perhaps engage the author, or rather the background, or rather perhaps who it's directed to. These become important questions, and I try and make separate videos on those. But I think regarding this series, I would like to stick with the criticism itself, which I think is what is coming together nicely. Anyway, thank you for your time. I hope you have a lovely evening, and we will catch each other again soon. Bye bye.